2 cops laughed and took photos as I bled out on the street, calling me a worthless hooker who deserved it and making me crawl to their patrol car. Then they found the wire taped to my ribs that said Property of DA's Office, Special Prosecutions Unit, and realized I was the undercover prosecutor who'd been investigating a trafficking ring for 6 months. One officer even dug his thumb into my wound while checking my pulse and said, "These cockroaches are hard to kill." Cops laughed as I bled out because they thought I was a worthless junkie, not knowing I was an undercover prosecutor. After getting stabbed during a 6-month undercover operation investigating a trafficking ring, I ended up crawling onto the main street with blood pouring between my fingers. I stumbled forward with my insides on fire from the blade wound, my tight dress soaked through with blood. The wire that blew my cover still taped to my ribs beneath the fabric. 2 uniforms finally arrived, and relief washed over me until I saw how Officer Howard's face twisted when he registered my outfit. The disgust in his eyes hit harder than the blade had. "Another hooker got herself stabbed," rolled off his tongue like he'd said it 100 times before. Brooks was still stretching beside the patrol car while I bled out 10 feet away. They started pulling on gloves with zero urgency, and Howard actually waved me forward like I was bothering him by dying too far from his vehicle. I pressed harder against the wound and made the choice to survive. My legs shook as I forced myself upright, because apparently bleeding to death wasn't enough to warrant them walking over. When I finally reached the patrol car, Howard looked me up and down with this cold assessment. "What did you expect working these streets?" he asked, like we were having a casual conversation about the weather. I tried to speak, but only managed to gasp out, "Please help," between the waves of pain. Brooks actually mimicked me in this high-pitched voice that made Howard laugh. "We've heard every sob story, sweetheart. What happened? Your pimp hit you up? Job get too rough? Save the tears for someone who cares. You chose to spread your legs for money." My vision started tunneling, but Howard wasn't done. "What's your real name?" When I struggled to answer through the pain, he made me repeat it 3 times while they both laughed. By the 3rd time, my hands were going numb, and I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. Howard looked at me like I was literal garbage that had somehow learned to bleed. "These all have AIDS," he said, backing away from the blood pooling around me. He grabbed his radio, and I heard him tell dispatch that they got a probable OD. Working girl, low priority. I forced myself to speak up, begging him to make it high priority, but he used his boot to push me back when I reached for him. Next thing I knew, he was tossing me a disgusting rag from the gutter and telling me to apply pressure if I wasn't high enough. I refused to let that rag touch my skin and just left it on the floor. That seemed to offend Brooks more than the blood. "Maybe this is your wake-up call to get a real job," Brooks offered like he was doing me a favor. "Could have been a waitress or something, but no, you wanted to be a whore so bad." Howard nodded and launched into how these people were ruining the whole neighborhood. Property values tanking. Kids can't even walk to school without seeing this filth. Their voices were starting to fade in and out as I felt my body shutting down and knew I was losing the fight. Everything was going cold. "I've got a daughter," Howard said suddenly, 15 years old. I'd call her before I'd let her end up like this. Brooks agreed and said something about tough love. They went back and forth about how I'd chosen this life, while my blood kept pooling wider on the concrete. The conversation died when they realized I was barely conscious, and Brooks saw an opportunity. "Perfect timing," he said, getting his phone ready for his buddy in Vice who collects these. He crouched down to get better angles while Howard watched approvingly. The camera flash felt like needles in my brain as they discussed my upcoming death. "Bet she'll lay here till morning. The rats and junkies will strip her before anyone reports it," Howard said casually. Brooks agreed and added his own prediction. "Maybe they'll find her in a dumpster next week. These streets clean themselves." He switched from photos to video and narrated for his buddy. "Another day, another dead hooker." Then he grabbed my wrist, pretending to be professional. "Let me check vitals." Brooks used checking my pulse as an excuse to dig his thumb into my wrist until I whimpered. "Still ticking. These cockroaches are hard to kill." My whole body betrayed me then, with convulsions so violent they tore the wire from my ribs. The recording device slipped out from my dress and crashed onto the street. They both froze. Brooks stopped mid-sentence about cockroaches. Howard's laugh died in his throat. The device sat there recording everything with "Property of DA's Office" etched across the metal. They both recognized what they were looking at. Howard bent closer and read the full inscription. "Special Prosecutions Unit." His face went from confused to horrified. "Oh God," he said, backing away. Oh God, no. Brooks started shaking. The trafficking prosecutor, I heard Brooks whisper before I blacked out completely. The world spun back into focus with harsh fluorescent lights burning through my eyelids. My throat felt raw and something plastic pressed against my face, an oxygen mask. The beeping of machines filled my ears as I tried to move, but pain shot through my abdomen like lightning. A nurse appeared, in my peripheral vision, adjusting an IV bag. She noticed my eyes tracking her movements and pressed a call button. Within minutes, a doctor entered, followed by 2 detectives in suits, not uniforms. That was something. The doctor checked my vitals while explaining that I'd lost significant blood, but the surgery had gone well. The blade had missed major organs by millimeters. Lucky, he called it. The detectives waited until he finished before introducing themselves as internal affairs. Over the next hour, they took my statement. I gave them everything, from the moment I crawled onto that street to the instant Brooks read the inscription on my recording device. They exchanged glances when I described Howard's comments about his daughter and Brooks taking photos for his buddy in Vice. The lead detective, a woman with graying hair pulled back tight, assured me the wire recording survived intact. Every word those officers said was preserved in digital clarity. She left her card on my bedside table and promised to return once I'd recovered more. My supervisor from the Special Prosecutions Unit arrived that afternoon. He looked exhausted, probably from damage control meetings. The trafficking case I'd spent 6 months building was compromised now that my cover was blown, but we'd gathered enough evidence for multiple arrests. Small comfort while lying in a hospital bed with stitches holding my insides together. He explained that Howard and Brooks were on administrative leave pending investigation. Standard procedure. The way his jaw tightened when he said it told me he wanted more immediate consequences. He also mentioned that word had spread through the department about what happened. Some officers were appalled. Others were already circling wagons. Physical therapy started 3 days later. The therapist helped me take my first steps since the stabbing, supporting my weight as I shuffled down the hospital corridor. Each movement pulled at the stitches, but I forced myself forward. I had to get strong enough to see this through. My mother flew in from out of state, bringing clothes and toiletries from home. She tried to convince me to transfer back home for recovery, maybe take a break from prosecution work. I let her fuss over me, adjusting pillows and organizing flowers from colleagues, but we both knew I wasn't going anywhere. The internal affairs detectives returned on day 5 with follow-up questions. They'd reviewed the wire recording and needed clarification on certain timeline details. As we talked, I learned that Brooks' friend in Vice was also under investigation now. Apparently, collecting photos of dying women wasn't his only problematic hobby. A week into recovery, I had my first visitor from the department who wasn't there officially. A patrol officer named Wilt knocked hesitantly before entering. He'd heard about what happened and wanted to apologize on behalf of decent cops. His partner waited in the hallway, equally uncomfortable but wanting to show support. Their visit opened floodgates. Over the next few days, officers and staff from various departments stopped by. Some brought cards. Others just wanted to express disgust at Howard and Brooks' behavior. A few admitted they'd witnessed similar attitudes but never reported it. The divide in the department was becoming clear. My physical recovery progressed steadily. The nurses taught me to change my own dressings, warning signs to watch for, and exercises to rebuild core strength. I practiced walking longer distances each day, first with a walker, then unassisted. The pain medication made everything fuzzy, but I started weaning off it as soon as possible. 2 weeks after the stabbing, I was discharged with strict instructions to rest. My mother had prepared my apartment, stocking the refrigerator and setting up a recovery area in the living room. Everything I might need was within easy reach. She'd taken leave from her job to stay with me, despite my protests. The first night home, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt Brooks's thumb digging into my wrist. Heard Howard comparing me to garbage. The wire recording played on repeat in my mind. I'd spent months training for undercover work, but nothing prepared me for being left to die by the people sworn to protect and serve. My mother found me sitting at the kitchen table at 3:09 a.m., laptop open to news articles about the incident. The department had released a carefully worded statement about officers under investigation for procedural violations. No mention of them assuming I was a sex worker, no mention of the photos or their commentary about rats and dumpsters. She made tea while I vented about the sanitized version being fed to the public. Why would two cops be so quick to write off someone bleeding on the street? There's something unsettling about how casual Howard and Brooks were, like they'd done this routine before. The trafficking ring I'd infiltrated was getting more coverage than the officers who'd almost let me bleed out. She listened without trying to fix it, just letting me process the anger that pain medication had been numbing. The next morning brought a call from Internal Affairs. They needed me to come in for a formal recorded interview once I was medically cleared. The investigation was expanding. Other complaints about Howard and Brooks had surfaced, dating back years. Women who'd been dismissed, mocked, or mistreated. Most never filed official reports, knowing how it would go. I spent the following days building my strength and reviewing case files. The trafficking investigation would continue without me, but I could still contribute from desk duty. My supervisor called daily with updates, careful to keep me in the loop while respecting my recovery time. 3 weeks post-stabbing, I returned to the office for the Internal Affairs interview. Walking through the building felt different now. Conversations stopped when I passed. Some colleagues offered supportive nods. Others avoided eye contact entirely. The divide that started in my hospital room had spread throughout the department. The interview lasted 4 hours. They wanted every detail, every word, every moment from when I first encountered Howard and Brooks. I walked them through it methodically, keeping my voice steady even when describing the worst parts. The lead detective took notes while her partner operated the recording equipment. When we finished, she informed me that Howard had hired a lawyer and was fighting the administrative leave. Brooks was cooperating, but downplaying everything as a misunderstanding. They'd both given statements claiming they were following procedure for an unknown, injured person who appeared intoxicated. I asked about the wire recording. She confirmed it captured everything clearly, but their lawyers were already arguing about context and interpretation. They claimed their comments were taken out of context, that they were simply expressing frustration about crime in the area. The photos Brooks took were documentation for a potential crime scene. The union was backing them, of course. 2 officers with clean records versus 1 prosecutor who'd been undercover as a sex worker. They were betting on bias to muddy the waters. The detective assured me the evidence was strong, but her tone suggested she'd seen strong cases fall apart before. I left that meeting exhausted, but determined. My mother drove me home, glancing over with concern as I stared out the window. She'd extended her stay indefinitely, worried about my physical and mental state. I appreciated her presence, even as I itched to be fully independent again. That evening, my phone rang with an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Heavy breathing filled the line before a muffled voice spoke. They knew where I lived. They knew I was alone. They suggested I think carefully about pursuing this complaint. The line went dead before I could respond. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt oddly calm as I called Internal Affairs to report the threat. They'd warned me something like this might happen. Officers under investigation sometimes had friends willing to intimidate witnesses. They promised to increase patrols near my apartment and suggested I vary my routines. My mother overheard the call and immediately began researching security systems. By midnight, she'd ordered cameras, new locks, and a video doorbell. I let her channel her worry into action while I focused on what came next. If they thought anonymous threats would make me back down, they'd severely underestimated me. The next few days passed quietly. I continued physical therapy, gradually increasing my activity level. The stitches came out, leaving an angry red scar across my abdomen. My mother documented everything for potential civil proceedings, though I hadn't decided whether to pursue that route yet. A month after the stabbing, I was cleared for light duty. Returning to work felt like reclaiming part of myself. My desk had piled high with cards and messages of support. I spent the morning sorting through them, touched by colleagues who'd reached out during my absence. My supervisor briefed me on the trafficking case progress. They'd made 15 arrests based on intelligence I'd gathered. The organization was crumbling without its key players. It should have felt like victory, but the shadow of Howard and Brooks tainted everything. That afternoon, word spread through the office that Brooks had been suspended without pay. Apparently, the investigation into his vice department friend had uncovered more disturbing behavior. The photo collection was just the tip of a very dark iceberg. Howard remained on administrative leave, still fighting through union channels. I threw myself into paperwork, catching up on cases and preparing testimony for upcoming trials. Staying busy helped manage the anxiety that crept in during quiet moments. My mother finally returned home after extracting promises that I'd call daily and visit soon. Living alone again felt strange. Every noise made me hypervigilant. I checked locks obsessively and kept my phone charged and within reach at all times. The security system my mother installed provided some comfort, but I knew it was just expensive peace of mind. 6 weeks after the stabbing, Internal Affairs called with an update. The investigation was nearly complete. They'd interviewed dozens of people, reviewed years of reports, and analyzed the wire recording extensively. The detective couldn't share conclusions yet, but her tone sounded optimistic. That same day, I encountered Brooks at a coffee shop near the courthouse. He was in civilian clothes, looking haggard. We locked eyes across the room. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he grabbed his coffee and left without a word. My hands shook as I waited for my order. The barista called my name twice before I managed to move. My legs felt unsteady as I collected my coffee and headed for the exit. Outside, I spotted Brooks sitting in his car across the street, watching me through the windshield. He didn't look away when I noticed him. Instead, he slowly raised his phone and snapped a photo before driving off. I walked back to my apartment, taking a different route than usual, checking reflections in store windows for anyone following. The encounter left me rattled in ways the anonymous phone call hadn't. Brooks showing up at my regular coffee shop felt deliberate, calculated to remind me he knew my routines. Back home, I called the Internal Affairs detective immediately. She took down the details and promised to look into it, but we both knew proving intimidation would be difficult. A suspended officer getting coffee near the courthouse wasn't illegal. Taking photos in public wasn't either. The message was clear, though. They were watching. My supervisor called that afternoon with concerning news. Someone had been asking questions about my undercover work, specifically about any procedural violations during the trafficking investigation. The queries came through official channels, but seemed designed to find ammunition against me. He assured me my work had been exemplary, but the timing felt suspicious. The next morning brought another development. A colleague from the trafficking unit stopped by my desk looking uncomfortable. She explained that Howard's lawyer had submitted a records request for all my previous cases, particularly any involving sex workers or substance users. They were building a narrative that I had a pattern of bias or improper conduct. I spent hours reviewing my case files, documenting every procedure followed, every protocol observed. My record was clean, but I knew that wouldn't stop them from twisting facts to fit their story. The irony wasn't lost on me. Officers who'd left me to die were now scrutinizing my professional conduct. 2 days later, I received an envelope at my apartment with no return address. Inside were printouts of social media posts, photos from my college years at parties, casual drinks with friends. Anything that could be misconstrued. A sticky note attached read, "Prosecutor or party girl, the jury will decide." My hands trembled as I realized they'd been digging into my personal life. I immediately forwarded everything to Internal Affairs and changed all my privacy settings. The detective seemed genuinely concerned this time. She mentioned that Brooks had been seen meeting with Howard despite orders to avoid contact during the investigation. They were coordinating their defense. My mother called that evening for our daily check-in. I kept the harassment to myself, not wanting to worry her further. She had enough stress wondering if I was healing properly and eating enough. Adding fears about my safety would only bring her back on the next flight. The following week, I noticed a pattern. Whenever I left my apartment, a car would appear within minutes. Different vehicles, but always maintaining the same careful distance. They'd follow me to the grocery store, the pharmacy, physical therapy appointments, never close enough to prove stalking, but constant enough to ensure I knew they were there. I started documenting everything with photos and timestamps. The Internal Affairs detective suggested varying my schedule even more, maybe staying with friends occasionally, but I refused to be driven from my own home. This was psychological warfare, and I wouldn't let them win. My physical therapy sessions became a brief respite from the surveillance. The therapist pushed me harder each visit, rebuilding strength in my core muscles. The scar tissue pulled with each exercise, a constant reminder of that night. Progress was slow but steady. I could now walk a mile without stopping, though stairs still left me winded. One afternoon, returning from therapy, I found my apartment door slightly ajar. My blood ran cold. I backed away immediately and called 911 from the hallway. The responding officers, thankfully not anyone I recognized, cleared the apartment and found nothing missing. But someone had been inside. Small things were moved. A book shifted on the coffee table. Papers rearranged on my desk. The message was clear. Your locks mean nothing. The building manager reviewed security footage, but conveniently the hallway camera had malfunctioned that day. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. I had the locks changed again and added a door brace, but sleep became even more elusive. Every creak in the night had me reaching for my phone. Internal Affairs finally had concrete evidence of witness intimidation. The detective promised increased protection, but we both knew the department's resources were limited. She did mention that the investigation had taken an interesting turn. Other officers were starting to come forward about Howard and Brooks. Apparently, their behavior that night wasn't an isolated incident. A young officer named Luca reached out privately asking to meet. We chose a busy restaurant downtown where we wouldn't stand out. Over coffee, she revealed that Brooks had a reputation for taking photos at scenes involving sex workers. She'd reported it once, but was told to mind her own business. Now, with the investigation open, she was ready to make an official statement. Her courage inspired others. Within days, 3 more officers came forward with similar stories. One described Howard making a game of delaying medical response for certain victims. Another had witnessed Brooks planting evidence on a woman he claimed was soliciting. The pattern of abuse went back years. I compiled their statements and forwarded everything to Internal Affairs. The case against Howard and Brooks was building, but so was their desperation. The harassment escalated. Dead flowers appeared on my doorstep. My car tires were slashed in the supposedly secure parking garage. Someone spray-painted a crude message on my assigned parking spot. My supervisor suggested I take a leave of absence until the investigation concluded. I refused. Backing down now would send the wrong message. That intimidation worked. That officers could escape accountability through fear tactics. I'd survived the stabbing. I could survive this too. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Brooks's friend from Vice, the one who collected photos, had been arrested on unrelated charges. Facing serious time, he offered to cooperate. His testimony revealed a whole network of officers who shared degrading photos and videos of victims. Brooks wasn't just a participant. He was one of the most active contributors. Internal Affairs moved quickly after that. Search warrants were executed on both Howard and Brooks's homes. They found hundreds of photos on Brooks' devices, including ones of me bleeding on the street. The metadata proved they were taken while I was dying, not as official documentation. Howard's computer contained emails joking about the incident, including one where he bragged about making me crawl to the patrol car. The union tried to intervene, arguing the evidence was obtained improperly, but the prosecutor, a colleague I'd worked with before, shut down their objections. The wire recording combined with the new evidence painted a damning picture. Criminal charges were now on the table, not just administrative penalties. I was preparing for another Internal Affairs interview when my phone rang. It was Luca, panicked. Someone had left a threatening note on her car, warning her to recant her statement. The other officers who'd come forward reported similar intimidation. Howard and Brooks might be under investigation, but their supporters were active. We formed an informal support network, checking in on each other daily. Luca started carrying pepper spray. Another officer installed security cameras. We shared information about suspicious vehicles and strange encounters. It felt surreal, law enforcement officers protecting themselves from other cops. The investigation expanded beyond just Howard and Brooks. Their captain faced questions about why previous complaints were ignored. The Vice unit underwent a complete review. Years of overlooked misconduct were finally being examined. The department was in upheaval, with clear lines drawn between those demanding accountability and those protecting the status quo. My return to full duty was delayed by ongoing medical issues. The stabbing had caused more damage than initially thought. Scar tissue was affecting my mobility, and I needed additional physical therapy. My supervisor assured me my position was secure, but I worried about falling behind on cases. During a particularly difficult therapy session, struggling through core exercises, I thought about giving up. The pain, the harassment, the constant vigilance. It was exhausting. But then I remembered Howard's face when he realized who I was, that moment of recognition and fear. They'd left me to die, and now they were facing consequences. I couldn't stop now. The anonymous calls increased. sometimes silence, sometimes breathing, occasionally muffled threats. I recorded everything and forwarded it to Internal Affairs. They traced some calls to burner phones purchased near the precinct. The circumstantial evidence pointed to Howard and Brooks's supporters, but proving it was another matter. One evening, while reviewing case files at home, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They stopped outside my door. I held my breath, hand on my phone, ready to call 911. The doorknob rattled slightly, then nothing. I waited 10 minutes before checking the peephole. The hallway was empty, but a new message was carved into my door.
Drop it.
I called building security and the police. The responding officer took photos and wrote a report, but we all knew catching whoever did it was unlikely. I spent that night in a hotel, unable to shake the feeling that staying in my apartment was no longer safe. The next morning, I started looking for a new place to live. My supervisor finally insisted I work from home temporarily. The harassment was affecting not just me, but the entire unit. Other prosecutors were nervous, wondering if they'd be targeted for doing their jobs. I agreed reluctantly, setting up a secure workspace in my living room. Working remotely had unexpected benefits. I could focus on building cases without constantly looking over my shoulder. I dove deep into the evidence against Howard and Brooks, finding patterns that might have been missed. Their contempt for certain victims wasn't random. It correlated with specific arrests and convictions. They'd been targeting people they saw as beneath justice. Luca called one afternoon with news. Brooks had been arrested, not for the original incident, but for violating a restraining order. Apparently, he'd been caught near my old apartment building. The security footage was clear. He'd been watching my former home, not knowing I'd already moved. His desperation was making him sloppy. Howard's situation was different. His lawyer was negotiating, hinting at a willingness to provide information about systemic issues in exchange for lesser charges. The prospect disgusted me. He'd watched me dying and joked about it, and now he wanted a deal. But Internal Affairs was interested. Howard had been on the force for 20 years. He knew where bodies were buried, figuratively speaking. I attended a meeting with the lead prosecutor handling the criminal case. She walked me through the charges they were building: official misconduct, failure to render aid, evidence tampering, witness intimidation. The list was substantial. She was confident about convictions, but warned me the process would be grueling. My health finally stabilized enough for consistent work. The scar still pulled when I moved certain ways, and I'd probably never run marathons, but I could function normally. Physical therapy shifted to maintenance exercises I could do at home. Each day felt like a small victory against the officers who'd expected me to die. The other women who'd been mistreated by Howard and Brooks started reaching out. Some had filed complaints years ago that went nowhere. Others had been too intimidated to speak up. Now, with the investigation public, they wanted their stories heard. I connected them with Internal Affairs and victim advocates, watching the case grow beyond just my incident. Brooks' arrest had a domino effect. Facing serious charges, he started talking, not cooperating fully, but dropping hints about other officers involved in the photo-sharing ring. Internal Affairs cast a wider net, examining vice unit practices going back a decade. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had initially suspected. My new apartment felt safer, though I maintained all security precautions. The building had better surveillance and a doorman who actually stayed awake during night shifts. I slowly settled in, trying to reclaim some normalcy, but hypervigilance had become second nature. I still checked locks multiple times and startled at unexpected sounds. Luca and the other officers who'd come forward faced their own challenges. 2 requested transfers to different precincts. 1 took early retirement. Luca stuck it out, but she'd lost her naive faith in the thin blue line. We met monthly for coffee, supporting each other through the ongoing turmoil. The trafficking case I'd nearly died for reached trial. Testifying was surreal, discussing the undercover operation while still healing from its violent end. The defense tried to use the incident with Howard and Brooks to discredit me, arguing I was biased against law enforcement. The prosecutor shut that down quickly, pointing out that being left to die might reasonably affect one's perspective. Howard's negotiations continued behind closed doors. Rumors circulated that he was revealing decades of misconduct, naming names, and detailing cover-ups. Howard's trying to make a deal after watching someone die. That shift, from laughing at a dying person to suddenly wanting to help clean up the department, felt awfully convenient when he was facing charges himself. The police union was in crisis mode, trying to limit damage while maintaining support for dues-paying members. The department's reputation took hit after hit as more stories emerged. I returned to the office full-time, though with new security measures. Building management assigned me a parking spot near the security booth. My supervisor arranged for an emergency button at my desk. These precautions felt excessive, but necessary. Brooks's supporters hadn't all been identified. The psychological toll was harder to address than the physical injuries. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma. Unpacking that night, the pain, the humiliation, the casual cruelty, took months. Some sessions left me raw and exhausted, but slowly I began processing the experience instead of just surviving it. A major development came when Brooks' vice unit friend flipped completely. Facing decades in prison for unrelated charges, he provided internal affairs with names, dates, and a server location where officers stored their trophy photos. The technical team recovered thousands of images spanning years, evidence of a sick culture that had festered in plain sight. My case became a catalyst for broader reform discussions. City council members called for civilian oversight. Community groups demanded accountability. The department announced new training initiatives and policy reviews. Whether real change would follow remained to be seen, but the conversation had started. 6 months after the stabbing, I stood in my office looking out at the city. The scar across my abdomen had faded to pink, though it still ached during weather changes. Howard and Brooks were facing trial. The trafficking ring was dismantled. I'd survived both a blade and the aftermath, but the fight wasn't over. Their trials loomed ahead. More officers were under investigation. The culture that enabled Howard and Brooks still existed in pockets throughout the department. Real change would take years, maybe decades. I touched the scar through my shirt, a permanent reminder of the night they left me to die, and prepared for the next battle. The preliminary hearing arrived faster than expected. I sat in the prosecutor's office reviewing my testimony while she explained the process. Howard and Brooks would both be present, their first time seeing me since that night. She assured me security would be tight, but my hands still trembled as I signed the witness forms. That morning, I dressed carefully in a conservative suit that hid the scar. Luca met me outside the courthouse, offering silent support. We walked through metal detectors together, past clusters of officers who either nodded respectfully or turned away. The divide in the department had become a chasm. Inside the courtroom, I kept my eyes forward as I took my seat. I could feel Howard and Brooks watching from the defense table, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of acknowledgement. Their lawyers sat beside them, expensive suits suggesting the union was funding their defense. The prosecutor played the wire recording first. Howard's voice filled the courtroom, clear and damning. Every cruel word, every laugh at my expense, every moment they'd left me bleeding echoed off the walls. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. One officer actually left the room. When my turn came to testify, I walked to the stand steadily despite my racing heart. The prosecutor led me through that night methodically. I described crawling onto the street, the blood loss, their refusal to help. I explained how Brooks dug his thumb into my wrist while pretending to check my pulse, how Howard kicked me back when I reached for help. The defense attorneys tried to shake my testimony. They questioned my memory, suggested the blood loss affected my perception. They implied I'd misunderstood their client's attempts to help, but the wire recording contradicted every excuse they offered. Their client's own words condemned them. During a break, I passed Howard in the hallway. He started to speak, but his lawyer grabbed his arm and pulled him away. Brooks kept his distance, but I caught him staring with an expression I couldn't read. Regret? Anger? Fear? I didn't care anymore. The judge bound both officers over for trial on multiple charges: official misconduct, failure to render aid, evidence tampering, witness intimidation. The list was substantial. Bail was set high enough that both would struggle to pay it. As they were led away in handcuffs, I felt something shift inside me. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense of forward movement. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras and questions. I walked past without comment, following my lawyer's advice. This wasn't about publicity or revenge. It was about accountability and preventing future victims. Luca drove me home, neither of us speaking much. She dropped me at my new building, where the doorman greeted me by name. Upstairs, I found a package waiting. photos from colleagues at the trafficking unit. They'd made arrests that morning based on evidence I'd gathered during the undercover operation. 15 more predators off the streets. The following weeks brought a strange routine. Physical therapy twice a week, where I pushed through exercises that still pulled at scar tissue. Meetings with prosecutors to prepare for the upcoming trial. Sessions with my therapist where I slowly unpacked the trauma. Work at my desk, building new cases while the department underwent its painful transformation. Brooks cracked first. Facing decades in prison and abandoned by his former supporters, he offered to testify against Howard in exchange for a plea deal. The prosecutor called me before accepting, wanting my input. I told her to do whatever would ensure the maximum number of corrupt officers faced justice. His cooperation unveiled more than anyone expected. The photo-sharing ring included 12 officers across 3 precincts. Brooks provided names, dates, and access to hidden servers. Each revelation led to new suspensions and investigations. The department hemorrhaged corrupt cops while scrambling to maintain public trust. Howard's strategy differed. His lawyer filed motion after motion, trying to suppress evidence and delay proceedings. They challenged the wire recordings' admissibility, questioned the search warrants, and attempted to paint me as a biased witness with an agenda. Each legal maneuver failed, but the process dragged on. During this time, other victims found their voices. A woman who'd filed a complaint against Howard 5 years earlier came forward. Another described how Brooks had planted substances on her during an arrest. Their stories painted a pattern of abuse that spanned years. The prosecutor added new charges with each credible allegation. My physical recovery reached a plateau. The scar would always be there, a raised line across my abdomen. Certain movements still caused discomfort, but I could work full days, exercise moderately, and function almost normally. The body's ability to heal amazed me, even if some damage was permanent. One afternoon, Luca called with unexpected news. Howard had been attacked in jail by another inmate who'd lost a daughter to trafficking. He survived with minor injuries, but the incident shook him. His lawyer reached out about a possible plea deal. The prosecutor arranged a meeting where I could provide input. Sitting across from her, I weighed justice against pragmatism. Howard deserved the maximum sentence, no question. He stood by while I bled out, mocked my pain, and did nothing as his partner violated every oath they'd sworn. But his information could expose corruption that affected hundreds of cases, maybe even more. If cutting a deal meant dismantling the network that protected predators in uniform, I could live with that. I told her to make the deal, but make it count. He needed to serve real time. He needed to lose his pension. No cushy arrangement, no sympathy, just accountability with teeth. The negotiations took weeks. Howard's information revealed a sprawling network of officers who had protected criminals, destroyed evidence, and targeted vulnerable people for years. Each name he provided triggered new investigations. The department's leadership came under scrutiny for ignoring red flags and burying complaints. Brooks testified before a grand jury, detailing the inner workings of the photo-sharing ring. His former friends in Vice were arrested one by one. The server they'd used contained thousands of images. 10 years of dehumanization, recorded, shared, laughed over in backroom offices. It was worse than anyone imagined. Some officers fled the state when arrest warrants were issued. Others lawyered up and refused to speak. A few resigned quietly, hoping to avoid public shame. But the evidence was damning, and the public demanded answers. My role shifted from survivor to star witness. I testified before grand juries, provided depositions, and reviewed digital evidence late into the night. Every appearance meant reliving the night I nearly died, but it also meant watching the system finally turn against the people who thought they were untouchable. The main trial date approached. Howard had pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for cooperation. Brooks, however, decided to fight. His attorney claimed he'd simply been documenting a crime scene, that the photos were for internal records, not mockery, that his comments were gallows humor misunderstood by outsiders. We knew better. The wire recording would be crucial. I prepared extensively with the prosecutor. We reviewed every detail, every possible defense angle. She warned me the trial would be brutal, that Brooks's team would attack my character, my past, my work, my choices. They'd try to make me seem unstable, biased, untrustworthy. I steeled myself. I'd already survived the worst they could do. The trial lasted 2 weeks. I testified for hours. I described the sting operation, the night I was stabbed, crawling onto the street, being waved off like trash. I recounted Brooks mocking my pleas for help, digging his thumb into my wrist, posing with his phone while I bled through my dress. The defense attorney was relentless. He questioned everything, from the clarity of my memory to the motivations behind my undercover work. He implied I had a vendetta, that I'd allowed emotions to cloud my judgment. But every accusation only gave the prosecutor an opening to present the wire recording, the photos, the timestamps, the witness statements from other officers. The evidence was unshakable. Luca testified next. She recounted reporting Brooks years ago, only to be ignored. Other officers followed. Victims who'd finally found their courage stood up and told their truths. The courtroom heard how Brooks and Howard had mocked overdose victims, ignored assault calls, and humiliated the women they were sworn to protect. Brooks sat stone-faced at the defense table. By the time closing arguments began, his confidence had evaporated. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, Brooks stood as the foreperson read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom was silent as the judge revoked bail and ordered immediate remand. Court officers stepped forward and cuffed him. He looked back at me once, maybe expecting fear, maybe hoping for forgiveness. I gave him nothing. He disappeared through the doors. Sentencing came weeks later. The judge, citing a profound betrayal of public trust, imposed the maximum sentence on most counts. Brooks would serve at least 15 years in prison. Howard, due to his deal, received 8 years and lost all pension benefits. Both would be registered as violent offenders. Neither would wear a badge again. The verdicts triggered more changes. The department implemented new oversight policies. Officers underwent mandatory training on victim response and reporting protocol. A civilian review board gained real power to investigate misconduct. It wasn't enough. Not yet, but it was a beginning. My work continued. The trafficking ring I'd infiltrated was gone. 35 arrests, 28 convictions, dozens of women freed. The cost had been steep, but the impact was real. The scar on my abdomen still ached on rainy days. I still checked locks more than I should. But I was alive. I was working. I was making a difference. Luca had made detective, one of the youngest in the department's history. We met monthly for coffee, shared updates, and compared notes. She'd become a voice for reform from within, pushing for policies and accountability that once seemed impossible. Other survivors found closure in the trial. Some filed civil suits. Others simply felt validated at last. The ripple effect of justice spread outward into neighborhoods that had long felt abandoned. 1 year after the stabbing, I stood in my office preparing for another trial. This time I was the prosecutor, not the victim. The trafficking unit had a new case. I was lead counsel. My supervisor knocked, checking to see if I was ready. I nodded. We left the building together. On the way to court, we passed the intersection where I'd nearly died. The stain was long gone, but I remembered exactly where I'd collapsed. I touched my side, feeling the scar through my blouse. Then I kept walking, forward, always forward. Inside the courthouse, I stood at the prosecution table. The defense attorney offered a polite nod. The judge entered, and we all rose. I began my opening statement with steady, clear words and a steady, clear heart. Howard and Brooks had tried to silence me, but their cruelty had ignited a reckoning, and I was still here, fighting, surviving, prosecuting, for justice, for those they'd hurt, for myself. The work would never be finished, but it had finally begun.